Welcome back to History B354, the Reformation. And the reason I say welcome back is because by this point of time, you should have already listened to the first welcome lecture or talk, so to speak. The Getting Started module, you should have kind of gone through. And so, in this sense, even though this is the first lecture of the course officially in terms of the weekly schedule, we've already met, so to speak, in the welcome lecture. So welcome back. This is the beginning of the course. The first day of the course, as I hope you know by now, is January 9th, which is this coming Monday. But since this is an asynchronous 100% online course, as I talked about before, you're welcome to do it on your own time, but it would be best if you kind of kept pace. And so I hope you will get started, and so that we can all be together on the same page as we go forward. As I also mentioned, I will try to keep up with the lectures at least a week in advance. So if you work too quickly in advance, you may get ahead of me, so to speak, in terms of the lectures. But this is the beginning of the course. And so we are starting with a lecture that is a conceptual lecture. It is about how do we approach this thing or event or period that we call the Reformation. Now, I hope you've also read the introduction to the course document that I go through the structure of the course, the requirements, and the like, so you already know what this course is all about. Now, I had posted that document in the Getting Started module, but I've also posted it in the Week 1 module. So I think it is very important that you read that. And so please, if you haven't already done so, please do so. And there's another reading posted for Week 1 that I'll get to shortly. So we're looking at the Reformation, because that is, after all, the name of the course. It's the course that you all signed up for and registered for. And given that, I'm assuming that everyone is expecting something about the Reformation, whatever that might be. And part of the issue for me as an historian is to question these terms and labels we use to describe the past, because they affect how we understand the past. And so the first section of this lecture, Week 1, Reformation is Revolution, Theology, Religion, Politics, and History, which I think will be clear why that's the title by the time we get to the end of this lecture. But the first, we need to start looking at the Reformation itself and what it actually is, or how has it come about, and how do we approach this course. So now I'm actually on the third PowerPoint slide for this lecture, the Reformation, question mark. And the reason we have to have a question mark, because what is the Reformation? So often it has been treated that way, and it is usually based on theological determinations, but also on periodization. The Reformation has been seen together with the Renaissance as the beginnings of modernity, or at least early modernity. Now, we'll be talking next lecture about the basic structures of Christendom, which is medieval Europe, because obviously we need to look at what's changed, what was reformed, so to speak. Now, as a periodization, historians have difficulties because we look at the past, we look at the evidence, the extant artifacts that are still present, and we group them together in some fashion, sometimes very understandably so, other times simply by means of chronology. And the issue is, what constitutes a period of history? How do we go breaking up the past into these manageable concepts? Just for one example, late antiquity. Late antiquity is a periodization from approximately 300 to 600 or so. But 50 years ago, or approximately 50 years ago, that period did not exist, because that period was created by Peter Brown, a very famous historian who started writing saying this period of late antiquity needs to be seen as a period in and of itself. even the Renaissance. The European Italian Renaissance has been said as was the creation of Jakob Burckhardt, who was a 19th century Swiss German historian, and wrote 2 volumes on the culture of the Italian Renaissance in Italy. And it was that concept of this Renaissance that set the whole field. Now, if we look just at chronology, somehow Europe between 1300 and 1600 underwent dramatic changes. How do we get from one to the other? And in general, historians would all agree that in 1300, Europe was still medieval, whatever that might mean, somehow to characterize it. And I'll explain something about the term medieval in the next lecture. By 1600, it's definitely early modern. And so in somehow ways this course looks at this change from the end of the Middle Ages or the end of medieval Europe and the origins and emergence of early modern Europe. And how did that come about and come together? Now, with that context or that concept, historians have often distinguished between late medieval reform and early modern Reformation. As a very traditional approach, because somehow what happened basically beginning with Martin Luther has been seen as substantively or essentially different from attempts to reform previously. Now, we will be questioning what the concept of reform and reformation meant and what it referred to. Often it has been seen as simply a theological or ecclesiological reformation, to reform the church and to bring about a reformation of the church. And there's little question that it did do that. Whatever it was, something did that, and that the state of the church in 1600 was vastly different than it was in 1300. What affected that change? And I'll be arguing that there was certainly other factors as well, intellectual factors, theological factors, and especially political factors, which we'll get to in due course. But I've also argued, and that is one of the central arguments in my book that you will be reading, Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, that if we look at the sources, if we look at the documents that are extant, in the later Middle Ages, people were not making this distinction between reform and reformation. Calls for reform had been there all along in many ways. There is a famous phrase, both used by both Catholics and Protestants, in the context of Vatican II, but it goes back even earlier, and that is the church reformed, always reforming. Meaning that we always need to reform, to go back to evaluate our ideals, our precepts, our practices, and how can we do things better. That is essentially reform, and that was an ongoing endeavor in so many ways throughout history, even not related to the Christian church as such, but to just society as such. How can we do better? And in many ways today in our society, we're still doing the same thing. We're talking about how can we meet our ideals? How can we meet those grand principles of equality and justice for all? And really for all, because everyone would admit that they're not met. They're ideals that are there to guide us. So how do we get closer to those goals, those ideals that we see as something to guide us and serve as something that we should try to bring about? Now, that analogy doesn't really apply to the Reformation, but it does, I hope, get at this concept of reform and ideals. And in that sense, there was reform before there was reformation. Reformation is more radical. Reformation. That is what it is getting at. It is calling for a reformation of society, of the church, of theology, of politics. And in the later Middle Ages, what we find are calls for reformation, for Reformation. And that is one of the major articles or arguments in my book on Luther, just because it didn't bring it about. This late medieval Reformation, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, didn't reform the church and society, at least until other developments came about with Luther, etc., and the aftermath thereof. That doesn't mean it wasn't a Reformation. It just means it was a Reformation that failed or didn't take hold. And actually, I'll be talking later in this course too about the failure of the Reformation, because that was a thesis that was put forward in one of the chapters in my Luther book you'll be reading, talks about the failure of the Reformation. But we need to keep in mind that distinction, because so often, looking back at the later Middle Ages, scholars have said, okay, we know what Reformation is. That's what happens in the 16th century. So what happens in the 15th, 14th century cannot be Reformation, because that doesn't happen until later. So it must be simply reform, even if the terms being used by the people there, the sources, are calls for Reformation. Now, you will be reading a treatise that very explicitly on Reformation, the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, that was written in 1439, or approximately 1439, that gives a comprehensive program for reformation. It didn't come about, but it was there. And we'll be talking more about that again next lecture, because if we're looking for the Reformation, we need to know what came before it so we can identify what is actually new and different and what is simply the traditional approach that had always been there. Now, there will be several instances and examples of this, very good ones, as we go along. For example, just one here and now is that when Martin Luther stood before the Reichstag in Worms, the imperial legislature, or the Diet in Worms, in 1521, and was asked to recant. His answer was, unless I can be convinced from Scripture that I am wrong, it would be a sin to go against conscience. Therefore, I will not and cannot recant. God help me. Amen. The so-called "Here I Stand" statement was a later addition. It's not something that Luther said, but a later interpolation, but that's another issue. But this appeal to conscience has been interpreted as, here we see Luther's modernity, that he was appealing to the conscience over against the authority. Whereas actually, appeal to the conscience was simply a fundamental basic principle of medieval moral theology and psychology. The idea was the conscience was this spark of divine reason, the spark that had almost remained after the fall, almost, that told us right or wrong. And if we went against that, we would be sinning even further. Now, it's one thing to say our conscience is wrong. That was certainly acknowledged, that we can have an erroneous conscience. But if we act consciously against our conscience, that is a double sin, or another sin, a sin on top of a sin. It would be wrong. It's that little gnawing inside your stomach that you're doing something that you know you really shouldn't be doing, but you do it anyway. That's sinning against your conscience. And that was not a modern development of Luther. That was not an assertion of individuality over against institutional authority. It was simply the basic medieval principle. But we'll come back to some of these issues as we go along. So that's just one example in terms of trying to distinguish Reform and Reformation, whereas Reform is this ongoing process of always trying to do better, whereas Reformation is a reformation of the basic structures of society. That's what we're getting at. Now, we have then, going to the next point here on the Reformation slide, patterns of Reformation, because we really can't talk about the Reformation as such. There are reformations, different movements, or different patterns of Reformation. And this, too, is not my insight. It goes back to scholars from the 1960s and so. There's a great book called Patterns of Reformation, Hans Hillerbrand, basic textbook. I believe, if memory serves, even the textbook that I suggested for you is called The Reformations in the plural. And so we can talk about, as we will talk about, Luther's Reformation, the Reformation of the refugees, with Calvin, the English Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, and on we could go, because these are all different developments, different structures, and different outcomes. There is a very good 2-volume work called the Handbook to European History. I think it's 1400 to 1600 or something like that. It should be. It's in the library in the, I believe, at least in the oh, the room where you go, the rooms where you can't check things out. I don't know why I can't think of that term right now. What that room is called. The reserve book room. So it's there, it's on the shelves, and it's a series of articles. And one of the things they do is go through different patterns of Reformation. There's also a great series, the New Cambridge History of Modern Europe. The first volume is the Renaissance, and the next one is the Reformation. It too is written by a group of scholars, and it goes through the various patterns of Reformation. So talking about the Reformation is almost a shorthand that is too short. It kind of groups together diverse phenomena, diverse developments, diverse ideas, concepts, ideologies into one thing. And history doesn't work that way. Human beings don't work that way. And so when we approach this course, this period, this thing, this phenomenon of the Reformation, we have to realize that we're grouping together very different things, very different developments. It'd almost be like saying, okay, I'm going to talk about animals. Well, great. Animals is a category, and animals are different from plants, and they're different from minerals. But it's not uniform. Just think of the diversity within the category of animals. Now, there's probably even more diverse than the category, the Reformation, but that's what we're actually dealing with in terms of the singular, the Reformation. It's a category. We have to keep that in mind and what we're looking at to see how things all develop. Now, another problem or obstacle in some ways to approaching this period, these phenomena, is that the distinction between a theological understanding and the historical understanding. From the 16th century on, that which has been referred to as the Reformation, by scholars anyway, in general, has been based on theology. There's a exception to that rule, but I'll come back to that later too, where it's actually referring to religion, but I'll get back to that. But this idea of Reformation, especially by people from the outside looking at it, identifying it, has been based on theological determinations. First with Luther and then Calvin, and let's say the splintering of the so-called Protestant movement. Protestants, as I'll be talking about later too, there is no such thing as Protestants in terms of looking at things historically until 1529, when we get to the Second Diet of Speyer, which was trying to decide what the imperial policy would be for the empire regarding the enforcement of the Edict of Worms, which condemned Luther. And the Diet, once again, came down and said, no, we will enforce the Edict of Worms. And there was a group of princes and cities that said, no, we protest, and they walked out. And it was from that point on that they became known as the protesting or the Protestant princes and cities, or the Protestants. So we can't really talk about Protestants until 1529. And yet, everyone has done so. So the question is this issue of, are Protestants defined like I said, politically, theologically. Is this movement defined politically, theologically? Um, and in many ways, a Catholic scholar can say that Luther was right almost about everything. But, and a Protestant scholar can say that Luther was almost wrong about everything. But, meaning one's own theological positions have often affected or determined how we interpret and understand the past, at least in terms of this movement, because without question, I don't think anyone would question this, whatever the Reformation includes, refers to, was a period where theological belief, it's kind of a contradictory in terms, but I'll come back to that too. But theological belief was central as an historical factor, as a political factor, and we've gotten so away from that. And that is in some ways a good thing, depending on what we mean by good. In other ways, it makes it difficult for us to access this time when people went to war over what did the word is mean. The word is in the formula of constitution of the elements, hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. What did is mean? And there was essentially, as I said, war over that issue. I'll be coming to this again and again. The point here, though, is either we can address this theologically or historically. Those are two different approaches. And if you've read or if you do read the signed document or signed article that I wrote today, not today, I didn't write it today, but a sign for this week on history, theology, and religion, that goes into greater detail in terms of these distinctions. Now, for this course, I'm approaching it from a historical perspective. I'm happy to talk about theological issues with any of you over Zoom, kind of outside of things, but this is not a course in theology. It's a course in history. The problem is, starting in the mid-1960s or so, early 1970s, a group of scholars who were increasingly not Christian themselves started saying, religion is just, and theology is just a bunch of ridiculous gobbledygook, and it's, along the lines of Freud's an illusion, or of Marx's, it's the opiate of the people. We know it's wrong, and so why try to write a history of that? We should just forget about theology and look what is really important, the social structures, the political structures, and on we go. I would say that completely misses the point. For the historian, we can't really make theological determinations. We can't say this is right or wrong. As theologians, that's our responsibility. As individuals, we almost have to take a stance. But as historians, we have to look at the evidence. And the issue there is not, was this right or was this wrong? Was Luther right or was Luther wrong? The point is, what did people at the time believe, and how did they act based on those beliefs, regardless of whether we agree with them or not? So theology, as all intellectual developments, is an essential historical factor, not in the sense of whether it is absolutely true or not, but because it was held at the time, or various different times, as belief in the basis for human action, which did transform society and culture as we went through the further developments thereof. I mean, there are certainly analogous developments here in terms of, we could say, is democracy right or wrong in terms of the best form of government? We could have a nice debate about that. There's really no way to prove it right or wrong one way or the other. But as historians, that's not the point. The point is we look at what it has done in the name of democracy, so to speak, and to see that people believe these things what impact did that have? Now, we can even go so far as saying all the conspiracy theories, the QAnon people, the Pizzagate and the lizard people and the pedophiles and all those issues in terms of these, you know, conspiracies for which there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. We can just dismiss those. But far more important, I think, as historians, is to see how were those beliefs possible? How is it possible that people actually believed those things and then acted on them? Now, that's just, again, an analogy to theological issues, religious issues, wherever have you. And in terms of this course, in terms of the course, I don't care if you are a Catholic, a Protestant, a evangelical, a Jewish, if you're Islamic, if you're Buddhist, or if you're a convinced atheist. It does not matter in terms of trying to come to an understanding of this period. I would hope that this course will cause you to reflect on your views, whatever they might be, and your beliefs, whatever they might be, from whatever position you're coming from. And on that level, as I said before, I'm happy to talk about any of the theological issues or religious issues or any other issues for that matter with any of you over Zoom, but that's not part of the course. So the issue is that when we take a historical interpretation, we look at the debate over what does that word is mean. And we need to make the distinctions because it was very important at the time. We can't say what a bunch of nonsense that people were arguing about what the word is means. Well, that's pretty important actually because it gets into the philosophical concepts of being, because is the verb to be. What does it mean to be? And humans really still haven't figured that out actually. But that's another issue. I digress. Now, I hope that's clear. If you have any questions about that, let me know, because I want this to be clear for everybody what it is that we're doing, what it is we're approaching, how we're conceiving and dealing with this period. As I started going into more explanation on it on the document there, so if you do have any questions, just let me know. Now, the next slide gets to the major question for this course, which is the Reformation as revolution. Was this Reformation a revolution? Now, the point is, okay, if it's a reformation, it probably should be or could be. But this is not merely a question of semantics. It's a question of labeling and how we conceive things. What is a revolution? The term, I believe, I have to check, but I remember saying this, is first used in the published version, 1543, in Nicholas Copernicus' De Revolutionibus Celestium Orbium, the revolution of the heavenly orbs, heavenly bodies, or whatever you want to call them, which just meant a circle, a turning. Cycles is a term that was been around for quite a long time. Cyclical, I can't say that, sorry. Cyclical, well, never mind. I'm not going to stop this and, do it over again until I get the pronunciation right. The circular view of history was there in antiquity, and the Jewish and the Christian tradition then put forward a linear view of history. And how we conceive of what time is important for our understanding of what is the past and how did it come about and all those things. So that concept of revolution is more than cycles. It's something that is a fundamental difference. And in some ways, revolution depends on whose side you're on. We think of the American revolutionaries as heroes and patriots. They're the founder of our country. But if we talk about revolutionaries in South America, we think, oh, those are the bad people. We have, unless we're supporting them, then they're the freedom fighters. It's a real problem to deal with the terms and what the labels that we give things affect how we view them and come to an understanding of them. Now, there is no right or wrong answer in terms of whether the Reformation was a revolution. It's been talked about. Other scholars have written books about it. And we can go back and forth. The point is to use those concepts to analyze the material. That is why it's there. I think if you look at your take-home final, that is the question basically of it. And there is no right or wrong answer. There are good answers and there are bad answers. The point is not to say, yes, it was, and let's argue that it was. The point is to say, based on this evidence, we can see it as a revolution, or we should not see it as a revolution, and why. It gets back to analyzing, interpreting, and forming a historical argument. Now, there is a document in the course documents module labeled historical argument, and I hope you will read that too. Obviously, if you've not done so already, it is not that important yet, but it will become important pretty soon. So review that document maybe a couple of times, certainly before you start to work on your final exam, final essay, because that is the basis for historical argument, and which is the basis for your grade. So that question is not one that I'm posing, and I'm not going to be sitting here telling you, yes, it was a revolution, or no, it wasn't. It was something else. It wasn't a revolution. That's not the point. The point is to come to an understanding and to question the very terms we use to describe this thing. Yeah. That's what the major event or the major task for the course is. The major events, what are they? How do we label them? The things that are there that are still extant, the sources, the evidence. How do we put them all together? And what categories do we use to describe this major category of the Reformation? That's what we're getting at. And I hope if this is something that you're saying, oh, brother, what's going on now? Just tell me what the way it was. You can either ask me about this or just bear with me and try to follow along, because some of these concepts and principles I hope will become clear as we do go along. Even as I want to introduce them to you, so you know where I'm coming from, what the course is about, how I am conceiving of it, which is important since I'll be grading your work. Now, in that document that I hope you'll read, that you're assigned, required to read this first week, I do talk a lot more about belief, truth, and history. But that is not, again, what we're doing here, because truth is absolute. Truth is atemporal. Truth is in the realm of the divine, regardless of how you view God or divinity. As such, God, truth, whatever, is atemporal. This is an important distinction, at least it is for me. Atemporal, which means without time. Time is an enigma. I could talk a lot about that, but the point here is that so often we talk about eternity and eternal, but what we're really talking about is eternal duration, before and after, a never-ending before and after that has always been and always will be. Atemporality, there's no before and after. That realm of that divine realm, call it God, call it heaven, call it, whatever you want, call it the realm of universals, the ideal forms of Plato's view. It's without time. So we can't appeal to that which is outside of time to describe temporal events. We can talk about what is true and what is false. And when I said there's no right or wrong answer, there's not. There's good and bad ones. You can get things right. You can get things wrong. It'd be wrong to say that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Castle Church in Wittenberg in 1512. That would be wrong. But we're not talking about absolute truth. We're not talking about divine truth, whether it's revealed or not. What we can do is talk about how people believed divine truth was revealed and what impact that had on historical developments that we can discern. And the same there applies to them with what is true, because there are things that are true that we can determine are true. But that's different from the truth. We can say could be truth in history. There may be in an absolute sense, but we will never know that until we're no longer here, till we're no longer within temporality, within this ongoing succession of before and after, and on we go. We believe things, though, and what we believe about the truth, what we believe about God, whether there is God or is there not God, etc., 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 affects how we view history and understand history in the world we live in general. But that's not the historical approach. That's a theological approach, which is fine. I'm all for theological approaches. But this is not a theological course, as I said before, in the theology of the Reformation. It is, of course, in the history of the Reformation. And in this sense, the point of departure for doing history is to see history as scientific or as a science. And what does that mean? Well, as a footnote, I'm finishing up a book called On History. And if anyone's interested, I'll happily share the draft chapters with you on there. But I talk a lot about these issues in that book. It becomes very complex, or at least it's complex to me. But belief is an historical factor in terms of what people did believe and how did they act on those beliefs. But the historian can't appeal to the absolute truth or atemporal truth of beliefs to describe and interpret the past, because what are we actually looking at? There is no such thing as the Reformation. I said it was a category, and it is. There's no such thing as animals. They're individual animals, but those are labels. But there are things that exist independently of our labels of them. I could talk again a lot about this, but that's what we do. We look at phenomena that we can observe and that is observable, whether we observe it or not. Things that exist are physical things that are there independently of human cognition, of human perception and recognition. Do you know that Luther's lectures on Romans weren't discovered in terms of the manuscript of it wasn't discovered until like 1908, I think it was. I have to go back and check. There had been reports that he had lectured on Romans, but we had no idea what really he had said in those lectures on Romans until the early 20th century. They were actually dug up and found by Delisle, who absolutely hated Luther. He was a Catholic scholar and absolutely hated Luther. He saw Luther as the embodiment of Satan, who had destroyed the church and destroyed everything. But that hate, because he was a very good scholar, that hate spurred him on, and he came up with the manuscript and discovered it deep in the archives. It was there. Now, that manuscript had been there before it was discovered. If we look at those things, if we discover a new fossil, a new species of dinosaurs, those bones were there before they were discovered, and they were there independently of our discovery of them. That's what I mean when I say a scientific approach to history. What are the extant evidence? What are the physical remains, whether that means ruins, whether that means texts, published texts, because textbooks are artifacts, pamphlets are artifacts because they exist, whether we read them or not. That is what I mean by the scientific approach to history. It has to be based on the extant evidence or the extant things that exist in the present that signify, talk about the past, because that which no longer exists, we can't appeal to. It's the argument from silence. We can speculate all kinds of things in terms of Luther's lost diaries. I don't know if you were aware of this, but 30, 40 years ago, whatever it was now, someone discovered Hitler's diaries. Turns out to be a forgery. But at the time, it was a great excitement. Now, we could claim that we had discovered Luther's diaries, but then we lost them. We can't then appeal to them. We cannot appeal to what is not there as evidence in a court of law, much less in the court of history and historians. We have to base ourselves on what is the evidence. And on that level, history is scientific, almost as I would argue, at least here, as is every other scientific discipline. What do? We observe that which is and try to account for it and predict. Now, history you cannot predict. We cannot say, okay, let's look at what was going on from 1500 to 1530 and then close our eyes and say, okay, now let's predict what will happen between 1530 and 1598. We could not do that. But what the foundation of what the historian does is to analyze the extant evidences. And to that extent, history is scientific. Now, again, if you're interested in this argument in more depth and detail, just let me know. I can send you chapters from my book on history. But it's a basic point of departure because we're not talking about ideas. We're not talking about beliefs. That's not the object of what we study when we study history. We study the extant evidence and go from there. And that's the approach taken in this course. Okay, theology and religion. Because even if we are looking at the extant evidence, much of that extant evidence signifies ideas and beliefs. Those are important. A book, Luther's Lectures on Romans, that was sitting there in the library, unidentified and unknown, it doesn't have any meaning until we read it. It's just an object. It's a physical thing until we interpret it and read it. And so many of the sources or the extant evidence dealing with the Reformation signify theological and religious ideas, beliefs, practices, instructions, and everything else. So we need to be aware that those are the factors that we're looking at. And it's important historically to know the difference between the theological perspective of Luther on individual doctrines and the theological perspective of John Calvin. Major difference. Even more so with Zwingli, but that's also, we'll get to those issues. That's where we get back to, it's not an issue, though, for the historian to say, and Luther was right, or Zwingli was right, or Calvin was right. And here's why. That's a theological argument. It's not an historical one. But historically, we need to understand the minutiae and arcaneness of theological debates. We are not taking theological positions or judging those debates. We're looking at what impact they had, what were the issues behind them, and what effect did they have on the further development. I'm not going to spend much time here now talking more about theology and religion and how they relate, because I do that in the document that you should be reading for today, or for this week in any case. And if you don't, I hope you will, because that is an important distinction to make. And if we're talking about the Reformation as a revolution, was it a revolution in religion? Let's say the practice, the social practice and rituals, and individual beliefs? Was it a revolution in theology, the official doctrinal teachings? What is the difference between religion and theology, and how do they all fit together in bringing about this transformation of European society and culture? That's kind of what we're looking at and getting at. So those distinctions are important. But one that is equally important and indistinguishable from the other two, theology, religion, actually is politics. And I have up here the slide, the Reformation as a political event. Because in so many ways, distinct, not separate from, distinct from the theological and religious issues involved. It was a political event, without question. Now, we have, again, so depoliticized, so to speak, theology and religion, even though if we look at our world today, and we can say, no, we haven't, and I would say you're absolutely right. But in the 16th century and before, and on to the 17th century even, religion and politics were one and the same thing. You could not distinguish them. Cicero the great Roman statesman, had defined religion as a civic moral virtue. It was just something that you did. It'd be like saying, how can you be an American and not be patriotic? Well, you can be, depending on what you mean by patriotic. You can say, I'm an American citizen based on my passport. You can say, well, that doesn't do much. Okay, fine. How do we define the terms? How do we define religion? I could say that I'm not a very good American, but at least I'm an American. Therefore, I am inherently democratic in that sense, even if not the same way that you might conceive of as democracy. Same thing with religion. I mean, it is a civic political entity. And interestingly enough, what we will find, especially after next lecture when I go through the medieval Christendom, essentially, is a transformation during this period of the Reformation from a structure that was predominantly, I'm not going to say exclusively, but predominantly the ideology was that of a church state. There'll be a lot of discussions about that next week too, because what we think of that and what I mean by that in this case is probably very different. But it switches from a church state to a state church. Europe is, or to state churches. That is a radical shift. The Reformation, another aspect which I'll talk about, it was not the beginning of toleration or religious toleration or theological toleration whatsoever. It was actually the increased lack of tolerance on all sides, the bureaucratization of state control over religious beliefs and practices. It was a lot more toleration in 1400 than there was in 1600, but we'll be getting to those issues. But if it hadn't been for the political change, what would have happened? Would there have been a Reformation? And if so, what would it have been like? Marsilius of Padua in 1324, we'll be talking more about him next lecture too, advocated the abolishment of the papacy, not the priesthood, not of Christianity, but we should just get rid of the papacy. Now, Louis of Bavaria, the emperor at the time, thought it was a pretty good idea, but it never came about. It never politically stuck, so to speak. In the 15th century, the whole theory of conciliarism, this idea that the council is above the Pope, and the Pope works for the General Council, had a very or relatively short life, and it ended up being condemned by the Pope in 1462. So it lasted no more than 50 years, whereby it was deemed heretical to call for a council to correct a pope, and that will become very important for us when we get to Luther. Now, why was that the case? Because the papacy had developed in a monarchical situation. A council was a representative body. What European monarch in 1550 or 1450 would have accepted that he, because they were all in 1450 more or less, but the monarch as such, was working for the legislature? Not a single one. It was a dangerous doctrine for the monarchies, and therefore it didn't hold on. The concept of making ideas politically possible was important. The so-called radical Reformation, as I'll be getting to, and we'll see in the course of the 1520s and 30s and 40s, the Anabaptists, as they were called, was problematic because they did not have a political base. We'll be talking a lot more about this as we go along, but you need to have political support in order to flourish and thrive. So to what extent is then whatever this thing, the Reformation was, a political Reformation? And how can we see not Luther, but Frederick the Wise as the father of the Reformation? This too is an argument I make in my Luther book that you will read about. Frederick the Wise was the Elector of Saxony, Luther's prince. And if Frederick had turned Luther over, what would have happened? Frederick protected Luther. allowed Luther to survive, allowed his followers to survive, and went from there politically. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not an essential theological issue. There was. There's also political considerations and issues, very complex ones, and we'll be talking about some of those as we go. So, in terms of revolution, what was it? Was this Reformation simply a theological movement, a religious movement, a movement of the so-called quote-unquote church, which was distinct or separate from the state? Or was it society as a whole, founded on the political dynamics that made it all possible? Because otherwise it could have just been repressed. Interesting. Again, those are not questions with any right or wrong answer, but good answers or bad answers, part of the conception of how we go along to see, okay, this is a political development. We need to see it that way, because with politics, we can't divorce politics from beliefs and ideology, whether we're talking about the 16th century or the 21st century. Ideology is a word that is often, in my view, misunderstood. It's seen as usually like Marxists or socialists. Ideology is something always other people have, and it's usually not very good. It means you just are following these stupid ideals that you don't even question yourself. That's not what I mean by ideology. For me, ideology, as it was originally formulated in the 18th century, the term, is the ideas and beliefs that humans have that shape their actions in the world. It is those assumptions and beliefs of how the world works that forms one's own ideology. Everyone has an ideology. Everyone does, whether you're aware of it or not, because everyone has intellectual, mental structures that assume a reality, that assume the world works in a given way. And they're all different. They're all different. That's what makes history so exciting, is trying to understand those individual ideologies and how they work together to form, then let's say, macro level change. And then questioning our own assumptions of the way things work. That is the real purpose of this course, that I hope we will all do and continuously do. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. That's another thing. I'm not going to ever grade your opinions or beliefs. I'll grade your argument and how you use evidence to support those beliefs and opinions. And in this day and age, we're so wrapped up in trying not to offend people or trying not to make people feel uncomfortable. In some ways, I like to say I want to, offend everybody. And what do I mean by that? It is offensive and uncomfortable to have your beliefs and assumptions questioned. I don't really agree with Aristotle, who said that the unexamined life is not worth living. I don't really believe that. But I do believe that we should all constantly, unceasingly question our own assumptions and beliefs. Not necessarily to say they're wrong, but to come to a deeper understanding of them. So when I say I want to offend everybody by making you all feel uncomfortable, by challenging your beliefs, whatever they might be, I'm not doing that to overturn them, but hopefully to stimulate you to come to a deeper understanding, more sophisticated understanding of what you believe and why you believe it and how it all fits together. I hope that makes sense. Now, if it doesn't make sense, please, let me know. Email me, ask me about it, We can talk about it because I certainly, on one level, I don't want to offend anybody. I mean, honestly, I don't. So that distinction, I hope, is clear. And again, I'm not coming at this from any particular position. I'm not going to come up here and say that that Luther was right and that is the absolute truth, and so everyone who was not Luther was wrong. Even if they're only partially right to the extent that they follow Luther or Calvin or anybody else. Or I'm not here to say that all religion theology is simply the opiate of the people, and we shouldn't even really deal with it. But isn't it quaint? That's also not my position. Either of those positions are viable. How are they so? That's my point. Our opinions and our beliefs, I would claim, are not viable if they're simply what we feel or what we've been told. We have to ask why. Why? Why do we believe these things? Why do I believe that? What is that based on? Which again is not questioning to undermine, but questioning to deepen. And how does that all fit in with the political events in which we find ourselves and where we are going from here? Now, the final slide for today's lecture, Agents of Historical Change, is just getting at the same basic question, but in a little bit different perspective or viewpoint. Namely, the Reformation, whatever it was, or series of phenomena it was it a revolution or a reformation of European society and culture, politics, thought? Or was it a shift in systems? What were the factors that brought it along? If we look at Europe 1300 and look at Europe in 1600, there's clearly change, even though those are both constructs. But if we look at the sources dating around 1300 and around then 1600, there's huge differences. How do we account for those differences? This concept of constructing or reconstructing the past. Was it intellectual, including theological factors that produced the change? Were it social? Was it political, economic, religious, or theological? What causes historical change? Sorry, I was looking back at the PowerPoint. And that, too, is a question that we can never answer, but we need to pose it. And again, on history, I argue as strongly as I can about the fallacy of causation. That history, we can't appeal to causation in history, but we can appeal to agents of change. What brings about or affects or make possible change? Because we are constantly changing every day, every minute, every hour, every minute. We are all changing. Our individuals were changing, our societies are changing, our groups are changing, our countries are changing, the world is changing, and it never ends. Or if it does, it hasn't ended yet, and none of us may be here around when it finally does, or maybe we will. Who knows? What happens with the war in Ukraine, and whether we just demolish and destroy and nuke everybody back and forth, who knows? But the point being, it is looking at how do we approach and come to an understanding. I know I keep saying those things, but that's what it's about. History is not about truth. History is about understanding and coming to an understanding of that which no longer exists. Because the past does not exist. Only the present does. Only the sources do. And that is why you are going to be reading sources. If you've looked at the syllabus and read the introduction to the course, you know you have 4 source analyses to do. And then the final. Coming to an understanding of this change in European society, culture, politics, thought from 1300 to 1600 is what this course is about. At least giving some insight into some of the factors that led to the change, because we can't look at every single one. It's too diverse, it's too complex. No scholar can be comprehensive. Or if they can, it's with very minute things. I'll come back to that too. But that's kind of the basic perspective I wanted to give you. We're looking at their systems of meaning, which too is a complex issue. That is like the concept of individual ideology writ large. What are the systems of meaning where groups give meaning for themselves? And how do we handle those things? And that's the doing of history, is that reconstructing of the various systems of meaning. I mean, Luther, when he wrote something, it meant something to him. It meant something to the people who read what he wrote. Why and how? What does it mean to us? That's a separate question. But when we look back at what is the meaning in the past, not what does it mean to me today, but what did it mean 500 years ago? That is a difficult question. It also makes me argue that history is the most difficult discipline. Because it's dealing with human beings. Why do we do the things that we do? What are the different, factors involved of why we do something? And how can we ever know? But in some ways, that is our point of departure, with the conception of the Reformation not as a set thing that we just look at, that I am then here to present to you, but rather as an ongoing seeking of answers that have no possibility of being determined. It's always that why question. And the why question must be based on the what, when, and how. How can be problematic too. But why did this all happen? There was a book written a while back, and we were reading, actually, the 12 Articles of the Peasants are in the appendix. I'll be posting those for you, but it's called The Revolution of the Common Man. Where the common person during this period tried to bring about a revolution, tried to bring about a more equal society, and failed. And why did they fail? Because the princes and those people who were responsible for the Reformation squashed them. What does that tell us about this whole movement, too? The Reformation. For whom? And to what end? And those are questions, again, that have no real answers. And we must ask them again and again and again, not only of the past, but more importantly, of ourselves. What are we about? What do we think and believe? And why? And what impact does that have? Can we learn from the past? I would say, oh yes. But not if we view it as something of, if I only know what happened, I can have insight into what will happen. We can learn from the past by questioning ourselves, by expanding ourselves, by having the courage to question not only the documents that exist, but ourselves and our own beliefs and ideas. That is, for me, the major purpose of this course, the major importance of this course as we go through it. If you have any questions about that or anything else in the course, please just do send me an email and ask, and I'm happy to talk about it individually. If I get 10 emails all asking me the same thing, I'll maybe try to address it in the next lecture or so. But that is what I wanted to say for today in this first lecture. To get started, again, I hope you'll read the introduction to the course document, and I hope you will read what you need to read, the history, theology, and religion document that also talks about some of these issues in greater detail. Next lecture, which I'll get posted as soon as I can, maybe by the end of the week, I hope. Anyway, we'll try to set the stage for a medieval Christendom, the basic structures of Christendom, I think is the title. So we can start to have, even if only a little insight into what society and culture was like that then became reformed and or became early modern. If we see there's a change, what was it? And what came before, so we know what came after, and try to understand what is different, what is change, and what is simply continuity, and how do we put it all together. So next lecture will be kind of two of my courses in any case. B351 and B352, early medieval Europe and high and late medieval Europe, put together in one lecture, so to speak. So obviously it's not going to cover much of anything, but there's some basic concepts you need to know for developments coming on, such as what are the electors? What does it mean that Frederick the Wise was the elector of Saxony? And not the Duke of Saxony, and what that was about. What does it mean in terms of the Pope and the Emperor, those issues? So that will be a general discussion. I will get through it, I hope, as quickly as I can, to allow you to have that basis for looking at developments that we go from there, beginning then in week 2. So thank you very much. Review this lecture as you will. Should all of them. If there are parts you missed, you should basically, I think, take notes as you're listening to the lecture and then go back and review those parts, just like you would if we were in class. That is the idea for me. So, thank you, and I'll be back shortly with week 1, lecture 2 coming up. I'm looking forward to this course. I hope you are too. And be engaged and contact me with any questions or comments whatsoever, and we'll get through the semester. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.